my end. Looks like we're good with sound, so why don't we get rolling? Today, what we are going to do is continue our discussion of learning, and our focus today will shift from classical conditioning to operant conditioning. Remember on Tuesday when we got together face-to-face, we defined learning as this relatively enduring change in behavior or thinking that results from our experiences, right? And we talked about the first of the three major forms of learning, which was classical conditioning. So what I'm going to do this morning at the beginning for the first 5 or 7 minutes is walk through some of those big ideas regarding classical conditioning. We've got one final example to look at to sort of bookend our discussion of classical conditioning before we start talking about operant conditioning. So that's where we're headed next, operant conditioning, this learning that occurs via consequences. So that's the lay of the land for today. Finish up classical, make our way through operant. As I mentioned on Tuesday, observational learning usually spills over into next week just a little bit, and we'll probably spend about 15 to 20 minutes on Tuesday wrapping up that. That will finish the section on learning, and then we'll be ready to move into the chapter on memory. So a couple of the high points from Tuesday regarding classical conditioning. I'm obviously not going to redo the entire lecture, but these terms are things that you certainly need to have your head clear on as we move towards test 2, and now I guess it's 12 days. The unconditioned stimulus, remember, was a stimulus that doesn't require any prior learning, and it pretty much automatically triggers this unconditioned response. So the puff of air to your eyeball makes you blink, US and UR. The conditioned stimulus is the one that gets paired together with the unconditioned stimulus. So initially, what is to become the conditioned stimulus is a previously neutral stimulus. So that was the picture of, what's his face? On Tuesday, we did Bruno Mars, right, as the picture. So initially that picture doesn't make you blink, but if I do that picture repeatedly in conjunction with a puff of air to your eye, ultimately what will happen is the newly learned conditioned response will emerge, and what we'll see is you blinking in response to a picture that you didn't blink to previously, right? That's the relatively enduring behavior change that occurs here as a function of this classical conditioning. So you need to understand these terms. You need to be able to map them onto examples. So when you're doing your learning curve quizzes in preparation for their due date, which is Sunday night, you should practice with these. And as I said in class on Tuesday, even if they're only asking you for the US or the UR or whatever they're asking you for, look at the question again and see if you can identify these other terms as well. Because being able to do this, sorry about the tickling cough here, being able to do this is a big part of what I'm going to ask you guys to do on test 2. In addition to those terms, we spent some time reviewing these major phenomena of classical conditioning. So we looked at a learning curve to depict acquisition. We talked in some detail about extinction, right? How do I get rid of a response that has shown up? And what we said there was the formula is to detach the two associated stimuli. Present the CS repeatedly without the US. So if I repeatedly show you Bruno Mars' picture, but don't blow that puff of air into your eyeball, I can extinguish that blinking in response to the picture behavior. I can extinguish it by following that formula, right? That was extinction. In addition to extinction, we briefly talked about spontaneous recovery. When that extinguished response might potentially come back, it's usually not as strong, it usually extinguishes pretty easily. Then we talked about generalization, right? Where what happens is I sort of broaden, if you want to think about it this way, the range of stimuli to which I am responding. So I'm starting to respond to more than one stimulus with a conditioned response. So if, for example, I started blinking in response to a picture of somebody who kind of looks like Bruno Mars but is not him, that would be generalization. And discrimination would be a scenario where I can make a distinction and I respond to one picture but not to other pictures. right? So if I responded to a picture of Bruno Mars at blinking, but not to a picture of some other singer, okay, then I'm showing some level of discrimination, right? On the slide here, what we have is the dog salivating in response to a lower pitched tone, but not salivating in response to the higher pitched tone that is being presented to it. Okay, and we said discrimination is a good thing to be able to do as a learner because it shows that we can distinguish between some things that matter and that should give us a reason to respond, and other things that maybe we can sort of let go by the wayside and not worry about in terms of any kind of formal response. Any questions either about the basic terms of classical conditioning, US, UR, CS, and CR, or any of these major phenomena? If you've got a question, you can use the chat box for that. Are we good? All right. I hear somebody making some noise, so let me go in and mute everybody again. And that made the little rustling sound go away, so that's good. Slide this out of the way here and kill that. All right, so let's move into the final little example regarding classical conditioning that I think gives us a nice way to bookend our discussion here. And it's about work that was done by our friend John Watson. We met John Watson back in the first week of class when we talked about behaviorism. And so we want to talk today about Watson's work with little Albert. So Watson is here in the picture. I'm trying to point to him, and I'm not getting much cooperation. There he is. His assistant, Ms. Rayner, is here. And he works with little Albert at Johns Hopkins University Hospital in the early 1900s here to demonstrate whether we can classically condition emotional responses. And as you probably would suspect, given some of the examples that we did together on Tuesday, the answer to the question up top is yes, right? We can classically condition emotional responses. The very first demonstration I did with you with the dentist roll sound effect was about the classical conditioning of emotional responses, right? You guys had some pretty strong and negative responses to that stimulus, that sound. And as we talked about, you arrived at that way of responding via classical conditioning. So what does Watson do with little Albert here? Well, he demonstrates that he can actually train little Albert to become afraid of that little white rat that is between Albert's little feet there. And he does this via the use of an unconditioned stimulus that Watson knows will cause a fear or distress response in little Albert. What he uses is a loud noise, basically like a gong. Effectively what Watson does is he bangs on a steel bar right behind little Albert's head. And when you do that, tell me in the chat box, what is the unconditioned response from this youngster going to be when you startle him, when you scare him with a real loud noise behind his head? What's he going to do? What kind of response is he going to show? He's going to cry, right? He's going to show what we're going to call some kind of fear or distress in response to the noise, right? And that's not surprising. Again, US leads to UR, right? So US, the unconditioned stimulus, the loud noise, leads to fear or distress in response to that loud noise. Again, US leading to UR. What about the conditioned stimulus here? Well, what Watson wants to show is that he can have this child learn to be afraid of that white rat. So in this case, the conditioned stimulus is going to be a white rat. Now, how are we going to get him to learn to be afraid of the white rat? What are we going to do with the white rat? How do we do the training here in classical conditioning? I'm asking you to tell me in the chat box. What do we do with the white rat? Play the gong whenever the white rat shows up. And which one should come first, the rat or the noise? Yeah, the rat. So we're going to go rat, noise, rat, noise, rat, noise, 3, 4, 5, 6 times. You know what's ultimately going to happen? We're going to end up with a fear or distress response in response to the white rat. Okay, and now we have been able to show that we can classically condition a fear response to this previously neutral stimulus, right? This rat here is not something that the child is going to have an innate fear response to. And after about 5 pairings of the rat with the loud noise, the sight of the white rat by itself is enough to make Albert cry and show fear and distress. Okay? We can actually sneak in a couple of other ideas here and talk about discrimination and generalization with little Albert. Okay? Remember, discrimination is when you respond to one stimulus, but not to others. So little Albert showed evidence of discrimination by not being afraid of everything that Watson presented him. So when Watson presented him with colored blocks, little Albert didn't show a fear response. When Watson presented him with a book or a truck or some other kind of little toy, little Albert wasn't showing fear responses to those other stimuli. So there was some evidence of discrimination. There was also some evidence of generalization in that other furry white or gray objects were able to elicit a fear response in little Albert. So a rabbit, a white rabbit, similar enough to a rat that the fear and distress response generalized to the rabbit. A dog with white fur, for example, would be another example of a stimulus to which Albert's fear or distress response would generalize. A fur coat, a Santa Claus mask, even Watson's sort of graying hair might be enough if we put it down here for Albert to have a fear or distress response to that. Okay? So again, take-home message, yes, we can classically condition emotional responses. And the mechanisms through which you do that, again, involve pairing together the CS with the US, CS first, close in time, and when the CS by itself, when this previously neutral stimulus of the rat by itself elicits a response, we know that we have successfully demonstrated the mechanisms here of classical conditioning. Okay? Let me stop there for a second. Any questions about the little Albert example? Excellent. Okay, let me ask you guys a little polling question about how you might try to extinguish little Albert's fear response. So give this question a shot. You guys like the music, I could see that. All righty, let's see what you did here with Final Jeopardy. It's not really Final Jeopardy, but I saw a lot of people saying C. Why C? Why do we want to repeatedly present the white rat without the loud noise? What is that doing for us? How is that going to help us do this extinction work? Tell me in the chat box. Why is that the way to go here? I mean, you could say, well, Dr. Lemaikas, that's the formula for extinction that you gave us. But why does it work? What happens here when you go rat, 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 and no loud noise? He will stop associating the loud noise, right? CS without the US, it's disassociating. So both Alexa and Evan came up with some good ideas there, right? Going back to what I did Tuesday when I hooked my hands together like the cars on a train, we're unhooking the white rat from the loud noise when we do that, okay? That's the perfect scenario, right? It's very similar, this example, to that one Chris and I talked about training your nephew to be afraid of Barney. And I did that one on purpose because I knew it lined up closely enough with little Albert that I could leverage that when I'm talking about little Albert here with you guys. Are we good? Does that question make sense? Any final questions on this before we turn the page? How can you have both a CS and a US at the same time? There are two different stimuli, right? And so in this case, what we're saying is with extinction, we're going to repeatedly present the CS, in this case, the white rat, but we're not going to present the US, which is the loud noise. So remember, the US is the thing that automatically leads to a response. The CS is what was the previously neutral stimulus. So when we pair in this white rat with that loud noise, white rat, loud noise, white rat, loud noise, 5 or 6 times, we'll get that newly emerging, newly learned conditioned response, which is fear or distress in response to the white rat. Does that make sense? Yep, that's at the core of what we're doing here in classical conditioning. Excellent. Method, instead of unlearning the rat, does it cause the subject to try to find another reason that the gong noise plays? Potentially, but not always. And we don't even really worry about that part of it. Like, what does this organism make of that loud noise anymore? What we're simply trying to do is disconnect, right? Disassociate these things that have been learned, right, via, I'm trying to push something that's not working, right, that have been learned via association. We're trying to break that association. All right, good. Time to turn our attention to operant conditioning. So we've got an hour to walk through operant conditioning between now and 10:45. And as I told you on Tuesday, operant conditioning is this learning that occurs via consequences. It basically boils down to rewards and punishments. And as I said on Tuesday, that's deceptively simple when you look at it, because it actually turns out that there are 2 ways to do the rewarding and there are 2 ways to do the punishing. And I'm going to be super clear in explaining them to you guys this morning. Again, give you a number of different examples to help you get your head around this. And I'm going to highly recommend that you leverage the supplemental instruction sessions to get some additional practice, because I guarantee you there are going to be at least 4, 5, or 6 questions regarding operant conditioning and the 2 forms of reinforcement, the 2 forms of punishment. These are really big ideas, not only for this part of the course, but also for what we're going to be doing as we go forward in the course. And honestly, they're really important for your lives, as I'm going to talk about today quite a bit. If you're ever going to be a parent, a teacher, a coach, a boss, or really just have a relationship with another human being, knowing something about operant conditioning is going to come very much in handy. So what's the story here with operant conditioning? Well, we've got our old friend B.F. Skinner here with a rat in a Skinner box. And we've got a bigger sort of blown up depiction of a Skinner box on the next slide. We'll get to that in just a minute. I want to begin our discussion of operant conditioning by identifying 2 ways in which we can distinguish it from classical conditioning. The first way is already built into the slide. With operant conditioning, organisms are acting on their environment. They're exploring their environment. They're operating on their environment. That's why it's called operant conditioning. Think of youngsters in a preschool or kindergarten classroom and kind of checking things out and knocking around and pulling things off the shelves and playing with them and so forth, and how that feels very different from the relatively passive responding that we talked about in classical conditioning, right? With little Albert, we were bringing stimuli to him and seeing how he responded. I mean, in Pavlov's dogs, they're in this yoked condition where they can't even wander around the room, and we're presenting them with a metronome or a light or the ringing of a bell or the music from a music box. So a much more active form of learning is what we have here with operant conditioning. That's one way in which we can contrast these two forms of learning. The other major way that we could contrast these 2 forms of learning is to talk about the sequencing, like where is the action? With classical conditioning, what is shaping the behavior is what comes before the behavior. That's where the action is here, right? So with little Albert's fear response, that's really a function of what came before it. And what came before it was the repeated pairing of the loud noise with the white rat. So when we go rat noise, rat noise, rat noise, that's coming before little Albert is showing the fear response. In contrast, from this point forward, as we move through operant conditioning, it's going to be what comes after the behavior that is the big shaper of the behavior, right? So with operant conditioning, we said already, this is about rewards and punishments. It's about consequences. Consequences come after you do something. And the basic setup is listed here, right? With operant conditioning, what we're going to see is that rewarded acts are going to tend to increase in frequency, and punished acts are going to tend to decrease in frequency, okay? Again, as a parent, teacher, coach, boss, whatever, if you want people to do more of certain behaviors, you want to reward those behaviors. If you want to see them do less of other behaviors, you can punish them for doing those behaviors. The interesting thing about the rewarding that we're going to be discussing is that sometimes parents and teachers and coaches and so forth inadvertently reward behaviors that they actually want to see less of, okay? Your prototypical example of this is a parenting scenario where we've got a child coming up to the checkout line at the supermarket, and they're like, I want candy, I want candy, I want candy, and their head starts spinning around like The Exorcist. They throw themselves on the ground, they start rolling around, they're having this massive temper tantrum and meltdown. And ultimately, mom or dad might give in, and now what's happened is what? We've actually inadvertently rewarded that temper tantrum behavior, right? So they've done the behavior. Now what comes after the behavior? Well, to get them to stop doing that behavior, what we're going to do is present them with candy. What have you just trained them to do next time around? Tell them in the chat box. What are they going to do next time around? Yeah, it leads to a reward. I'm going to do it again. I'm not blaming people for that. I'm just saying it's a good example of how sometimes what happens is we inadvertently reward things that we don't want to reward, right? If I'm a teacher and I have a child that I only give attention to when they act up and they act disruptively in the classroom, I'm inadvertently rewarding their disruptive behaviors, right? So we'll get into those kinds of scenarios. Let's begin with a review of the basics of the Skinner box, because we can use this at a very simple level to map out the two forms of reinforcement and the two forms of punishment. So let's take a look at the Skinner box on this next slide. All right, so the Skinner box is set up here. It's basically a rat in a cage. There's a speaker, and we can pretend that we have a really large budget for our study, and this is a nice Bose speaker, right? Awesome. We got a Bose speaker here in the Skinner box. We've got a light. We've got a water dispenser. We've got a bar or a lever here that the rat can press on, and we've got a food dispenser down below. The people who drew this figure were a little bit too nice because they failed to include the electrified floor here in the Skinner box, via which we can deliver shocks to the rat. Okay, so this is the setup that we've got in the basic Skinner box. Again, that floor is connected to an outlet over here. We can plug it in and give the rat some shocks. All right, let's pretend that what we have as our target behavior for this rat, what we want the rat to do, is to press on the lever, press on the bar. Okay, if we want the rat to press on the lever, press on that bar, we've got a couple of basic options. There's really two different ways we can get the rat to learn to press on that lever or press on that bar. Okay, so if you have an idea, tell me in the chat box, what should you do to get the rat to learn to press on the lever? Going to press on that bar. How are we going to get him to do it? Okay, Francisco is going in the direction of stopping the shocking, and Kristen wants to present him with food. Those two guys have already given us the two basic forms of reinforcement. So we're going to talk about positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. And you guys actually nailed both of these. The idea from Kristen to present the rat with food is called positive reinforcement. If When the rat presses on the bar, we present him with food in the dispenser. That's called positive reinforcement. Okay? I'm going to explain to you why it's called positive in just a couple of minutes. With the negative reinforcement scenario, who was it that said stop? Francisco said, stop the shocking. What we're going to do with negative reinforcement is have a scenario where when you do the behavior, it eliminates, it terminates, it helps us to avoid something that we don't like. In this case, for the rat, it's being shocked via this electrified floor. So those are two forms of reinforcement. Okay, what I want you to put in your notes right now before I give you the slide on reinforcement is this statement. Reinforcement always leads to more of the behavior. Reinforcement always, always, always leads to more of the behavior. If the rat presses on the bar and we present him with food, that is going to lead to an increase in the frequency with which he presses on the bar. Conversely, for negative reinforcement, if the rat presses on the bar and when he does that, it makes the shocks go away, he's going to learn to press on the bar with increasing frequency because he's got a reliable mechanism through which he can eliminate this thing that he doesn't like, namely the shocks. Okay? Now, having laid them out here, what I'm going to tell you is this, that the sticky one that screws people up more than any other concept in this section of the course, and honestly, more than any other concept in the entire course, is negative reinforcement. Okay? Somewhere along the line, some wrong-headed parent or teacher or coach has misused the term negative reinforcement, and they said negative reinforcement when they were really talking about punishment. Okay? There are about 5 or 6 things that really bug me in this world. That's one of them. Okay? Because negative reinforcement is an essential tool for you to use to get more of a behavior. It is not punishment. Put that in your notes. Negative reinforcement does not equal punishment. In fact, it's the opposite of punishment. Because when we talk about punishment in another 5 or 10 minutes, you're going to see that punishment is a scenario where it makes the behavior stop, where it makes the behavior decrease in frequency. Negative reinforcement is the opposite. Negative reinforcement is going to lead to more and more of the behavior. Okay? So let's talk about positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement with the next slide. Again, I'll give you some examples and I'll give you some ways to keep this stuff clear in your mind. All right, so what I want you to put in your notes at this point is this idea about 2 ways to increase behavior. So at the top of the slide here, 2 ways to increase behavior. So again, if you're going to be a mom or a dad, a teacher, a coach, a boss, you're going to have interactions with other human beings. You've got 2 ways to get them to do more of what you want them to do more. You can use either positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement. Just to keep this straight, I'm going to drop a line across and say, let's just focus above the line for a minute. Positive reinforcement is the simple one. It says here as a definition, a response is strengthened by the subsequent presentation of a stimulus. What does that mean? Well, let's parse this. The part that says a response is strengthened is why this is called reinforcement, because we've already said reinforcement always leads to more of the behavior. And the positive part is not positive good, it's positive something being presented. So positive reinforcement begins with a P, presentation begins with a P. So I want you to stop thinking about positive as good in this context and think about positive as something being added in, something being injected, if you will, into the situation. So here's the example built into the slide. Okay, the child cleans his or her room, and as a consequence, what I do is I present them with candy for doing that. Okay? So again, a response is strengthened by the subsequent presentation of a stimulus. They learn to clean their room because they know what will happen is they will be presented with candy. Okay? So positive reinforcers would include things like food or drink, physical contact. Attention is a huge positive reinforcer for kids. Praise, compliments, applause, money, all of these are positive reinforcers that are used to get people to do more of behaviors that we want them to do more of, okay? Before we finish today, we'll make some distinctions between the food and drink and candy kinds of positive reinforcers, which we're going to call primary reinforcers, and the other things like attention and praise and money, which we're going to call secondary reinforcers, okay? The positive reinforcement is simple, right? You share your toys with your cousin. I say good job, and I toss M&Ms in your direction, okay? Where it gets confusing, again, is down below when we get into negative reinforcement. People mix this up with punishment all the time. Don't do it, okay? I'm being super clear here so you get your head around this and not have any problems. So negative reinforcement, it says a response is strengthened. That's why it's reinforcement, because reinforcement always leads to more of the behavior, by the subsequent removal or avoidance of an aversive stimulus. So the key word here is removal, right? It's something being subtracted. It's something being avoided, something being eliminated or terminated. All those words will work. So it's not negative in the sense of bad. It's negative in the sense of something being removed or subtracted or avoided. I like all those words as a way to help you keep straight in your mind the idea here with negative reinforcement. So same behavior, child cleans his or her room. Now the mechanism through which they learn to do that more is different. Instead of presenting something, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop nagging them. Clean your room, clean your room, clean your room, clean your room. They clean it. I stop nagging them to clean their room, okay? So again, a response is strengthened by the subsequent removal or avoidance of an aversive stimulus. If that's a new word for you or a new phrase, aversive stimulus, it's just something that you find annoying, something that you find bothersome, okay? Let me give you another good example of negative reinforcement. I have a baby who's crying, and I've learned that when I pick up the baby, what happens? Let's assume it's a pretty easy temperament baby. When I pick up the baby, what happens to the crying? If I'm lucky, the baby stops crying, right? So Evan's got it. So I've learned a way to terminate the crying by picking up the baby. My baby picking up behavior is being negatively reinforced, right? So the baby picking up behavior is being negatively reinforced. If I eat to get rid of the hunger pains in my stomach, the eating behavior is being negatively reinforced. If I clean up the sink to get rid of the mess which bothers me, that clean the sink behavior is being negatively reinforced. My favorite example is going to be one where you have a headache. What do you do to get rid of the headache? You take an Advil, you take another pain-killing medication, and it gets rid of it, okay? So again, basically what happens with negative reinforcement is organisms learn behaviors that terminate, prevent, or avoid aversive consequences. You could talk about using an umbrella as a form of negative reinforcement. Tell me in the chat box, what happens when you use an umbrella when it's raining like it was on Monday? It's not confusing because the behavior you're doing is swallowing the Advil, and the consequence is you're getting rid of the headache. Right, you avoid getting wet. When you put sunscreen on, you avoid getting sunburn. That's a negative reinforcement scenario. Okay, the key thing is do not mix this up with punishment, because everything we've been talking about is about the fact that when you do the behavior, you learn that the consequence is to get rid of things you don't like. So you do the behavior more. Punishment is always a scenario where the behavior is going to cease. It's going to decrease in frequency and eventually be eliminated. Okay. So we got positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. Let me show you the other slide that I built in here. If I bounce down a couple here, right? So it's about driving fast. So it's NASCAR, and we want you to drive fast. So when you drive really fast and you win the race by driving the fastest, we present you with money. We present you with a trophy. Okay. We could also get you to drive really fast on Sunday by making it so that on Monday you don't need to work in the auto body shop. So when I win, I get a couple of days off and I don't need to do that. That's a negative reinforcement scenario. Okay. That's pulled in from one of the infographics in this chapter on learning. All right, so let me scroll back and go back to the Skinner box scenario. And I want to talk now about punishment. So let's talk about punishment here with the rat in the Skinner box. And let's pretend that what the rat has started doing, that we want him to stop doing, is scratching on that Bose speaker. We said it's like a $300 speaker in the Skinner box because we had huge grant money somehow. Excuse me, to get that really nice speaker. The rat is scratching on the speaker, and we got to get him to stop. Suggestions? How are we going to get him to stop? Tell them in the chat box. So when he scratches on the speaker, what should I do? Shock him. Francisco's got a great idea. So what Francisco has just described is what we call positive punishment, okay? What I'm going to do is when he scratches on the speaker, I'm going to present him with a shock. Okay. There's another form of punishment called negative punishment, and it's about subtracting out or removing something. What do you think we could do that would be consistent with that idea of negative punishment? Yeah, I'm going to remove something. When he scratches on the speaker, he loses the food in the food dispenser. Or maybe his favorite rap music is playing, coming out of the speaker. When he scratches on it, the music goes away. If he had a nice, like, lazy rat recliner over here in the corner, then we take it away when he scratches on the speaker. So those examples are negative punishment. Do you see already how this is not the same as negative reinforcement, right? Already it should be obvious that punishment is going to lead to him not scratching on the speaker. It's going to get that behavior to stop. Whereas negative reinforcement, I learned that when I swallow an Advil, it makes my headache go away. Okay? That's a negative reinforcement scenario. I learned to do that more and more and more. I'll give you another example of negative reinforcement. If I drink to forget about my problems, the drinking is negatively reinforced. I'm learning to do it more and more and more. That's not punishment. I'm going to drink more and more going forward because it's a great mechanism through which I can avoid thinking about and worrying about other problems in my life. Okay? So let's talk about punishment with what I've already built in for you on the slides here. So in your notes, I want you to write 2 ways to decrease behavior. Because again, if you're going to be a parent, teacher, coach, boss, or interact with other human beings and try to get them to do things, you want to have these tools in your toolbox. Positive punishment and negative punishment. And again, I will draw a line across so we can look at one part at a time. So above the line here, for positive punishment, what's the definition? A response is weakened by the subsequent presentation of a stimulus. All right, this is going to be good, right? Punishment is why it's being weakened by the subsequent presentation of a stimulus. That's why it's positive. Again, not positive good, positive something being presented or something being added. So I'm going to type in the word added above positive again because I don't need to be thinking about good. I want you to be thinking about something being added in. Okay? So positive punishment. When I made these slides years and years ago, this was a battle going on at home where my middle son was constantly kicking his older brother. Okay? So the child kicks his or her sibling. The parent scolds the child for doing so. Okay? Say, no, no, no. I can actually remember with my youngest, if I would squat down and do a serious face, no, 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 and wiggle my finger a little bit, that was enough to get him to stop doing anything. Okay? Because he really didn't like it when I did that. Okay? Leading to a decrease in the frequency of the behavior. That's what punishment is all about. Again, getting them to stop doing things that you don't want them to do. Okay? Let me tell you about some pros and cons with positive punishment. One of the major pros here is going to be the fact that with positive punishment, what you're going to get is rapid results. So I'm going to sneak these in over here. Okay, with pros, you're going to get rapid results. That is, they are going to learn very, very quickly to stop doing whatever it is they're doing. So they kick their sibling and you smack them upside the head. I'm not recommending that, but I'm saying that would be an example of positive punishment. They're going to stop kicking their sibling really, really quickly. On the cons list, there are 3 drawbacks. Okay, first drawback is that the behavior change may not generalize. Okay, so if when they kick their sibling when they're at their grandparents' house, grandpa laughs and says, "Man, you got a good strong leg there, young one." They're not being consistently punished in different contexts. We may not see that behavior change go to 0, right? We may not see them stop doing the kicking their sibling behavior. Second drawback here is the possible eliciting of negative emotions in the receiver of the punishment. Now I'm afraid of my dad or my mom because all they do is yell at me, wag their finger in my face, and smack me upside the head. Okay, that's a potential second drawback to positive punishment. And the third concern would be that we are potentially modeling negative behaviors. What do I mean by that? Well, if the only way that you can get your child to stop doing something is to smack them upside the head, what do you think is going to happen when they're at the playground and they want somebody else to stop doing something? What are they going to do? Yeah, they're going to yell at them and smack them upside the head. I'm not saying you can't use positive punishment in a parenting scenario or other scenarios. I'm saying you've got other tools. The other tool here is negative punishment. Negative punishment, you'll sometimes see this called response cost. I'll just sneak this in here. In other textbooks, I know that they talk about this as response cost, but I love negative punishment because it keeps everything consistent. The definition is this: a response is weakened by the subsequent removal of a stimulus. So I'm going to keep doing what I've been doing, right? Punishment is why the response is being weakened. That's why we call it punishment. Negative because something is being removed. So again, we want to say it's negative not in the sense of bad, but negative in the sense of something being subtracted, something being removed or eliminated. So the scenario here is what? The child kicks his or her sibling. Instead of smacking them upside the head or scolding them, I take away their favorite toy. Okay, so they lose something, right? That's the idea of response cost. You do this response, and there's a cost for doing so. In terms of negative punishment, I weaken the response by taking away something that the organism finds desirable or satisfying in some way. Okay, look at the cons of positive punishment up above. Are we going to be making them have negative emotions towards us? Maybe, but not so much the fear and ducking when I go near dad because he might slap me upside the head. And we're certainly not modeling negative behaviors when we take things away from them. So probably your prototypical example of negative punishment that almost all of you guys probably suffered at some point in your lives is a timeout, right? What do you lose during the timeout? Access to your environment, right? Access to things going around you, right? So timeout is a really good example. If your parents ever took away your Xbox, if your parents ever took away your cell phone, or they said you couldn't go to the dance or the movies or whatever the case might be, they were using negative punishment, okay? I vividly remember with my oldest, when he was being kicked by the middle one, talking about this, modeling negative behaviors. I wasn't really doing that. I was modeling finding a favorite toy. And so my oldest would come to me and he'd say, Ben really, really likes that fire truck. When he knew his brother was in trouble, he would identify for me what things I should take away. I still vividly remember that. He'd be like, you could put that on the dryer in the garage and then he can't play with it. That used to be where we'd put things that were, being taken away. Obviously, for parents, what you take away, what you subtract out, what you removed should be a prize object or activity. It should not be your love, right? You can't say to your child, because you kicked your sibling, I'm taking away my love for you. I mean, I guess you could if you want to create like a mass murderer, if that was your goal. But certainly if you want good outcomes in your kids, that's probably not the way to go. All right? Questions about the two forms of punishment? Hopefully you see, right? Hopefully you see here what we've got is something that's really different from negative reinforcement, right? Just to drive this home. Look at all the stuff we just talked about here and how this is nowhere near being connected in or similar to negative reinforcement in any way, right? With negative reinforcement, what happens is I learn to do more of a behavior because doing so gets rid of something that I don't like. Whereas with punishment, what's going to happen is I'm going to stop doing things. Why am I going to stop doing things? Well, because either something is being presented to me or I'm losing something as a consequence of my behavior. Let me show you what I built in from the textbook infographic here. So now we're on city streets and we're speeding, and we don't want people to be doing that on the city streets. So what's the consequence here? Well, with positive punishment, I present you with a speeding ticket. With negative punishment, you might lose your driver's license. You might have it suspended. Okay, so that's a scenario where we see the mechanism through which you're learning to stop driving so fast is different. You're losing something, taking away, right? See it in bold right here versus adding something. Over here, we're presenting you with a ticket to get you to stop doing the speeding. Okay? All right, I'm about to give you guys a couple of little polling questions, so hold on for those. I just want to point you to table 5.3 for additional review of these ideas around positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, and negative punishment. No, it's not adding a timeout. Right, what's happening is when the child is given a timeout, right, when that's the consequence for the behavior. So I'm disruptive in class, I'm given a timeout. What happens is I lose access to what's going on around me, right? I can't be with the other kids. Look at the definition of negative punishment. A response is weakened by the subsequent removal of a stimulus. What's being subtracted out or removed there is access to playtime and the other children in your social environment, right? So you're losing something there. Something is being subtracted out and lost. That's why it's negative punishment. Let me give you a couple polling questions here. Good. So how about this one? What do we got going on here? Well, we've got Lori taking a bath every day. It helps make her back pain go away. Take a shot at that. See what you can come up with for that one. All right, I see lots of negative reinforcements come in. Now explain to me why it's negative reinforcement. Taking the pain away. So when I take the bath, when I do the bath-taking behavior, the consequence is the elimination of, the avoidance of, the termination of the pain. Very, very good. Any questions about that? It's right from an old test, by the way. Okay, that's the kind of thing you're going to need to be able to handle on test 2 in 12 days. All right. How about this one? The more often Matthew is scolded following a temper tantrum, the more frequently he loses his temper. In this case, the scolding serves as a what for his temper tantrums. So think about it before you start immediately responding here, right? What's the sequence? Temper tantrum, scolding, more temper tantrums. Okay, lots of people are saying C, positive reinforcer. You guys are in fact right. Now, clearly, we intend the scolding to be a punishment for the temper tantrum, but what's actually happening is the opposite, right? It's temper tantrum, scolding, more temper tantrums. So it's a positive reinforcer because something is being presented, and what happens is the behavior increases in frequency, right? Let's go back to our definition of positive reinforcement, right? Positive reinforcement. Where is it? There it is, Mark. A response is strengthened, that is, you get more of the temper tantrums, by the subsequent presentation of a stimulus. Temper tantrum, scolding, more temper tantrums. It maps right on to this definition of positive reinforcement. Does everybody see that? Any questions about that at all? Any confusion for you guys with that? Does that make sense? All right, cool. We have about 25 minutes left, and we've got three major ideas, three major concepts to review together. So we're in good shape here. His temper tantrums are positive reinforcement for scolding. That's a weird way to think about it, because really I wouldn't think about it that way, because the target behavior is his temper tantrums, right? That's what we're trying to get more of or less of as the parent or the coach or the teacher or whatever. So I would always use that as my frame, right? What's the behavior you're talking about? And then what are you going to do in response to it is something different, right? Yeah. So we want to focus in on what is it that we're looking at. The taking the bath, the swallowing the Advil, the sharing your toys, and then what do you do with respect to that target behavior? Awesome. Okay, so let's talk about shaping. This is actually a fairly straightforward idea that I don't need to spend, I don't think, too much time on. With shaping, what we do is we use reinforcers to guide people or animals' behavior towards closer and closer approximations of the target behavior. We can get complex target behaviors accomplished by rewarding successive approximations. This is a phrase you're going to see a fair amount when people talk about and write about shaping. Successive approximations in English is baby steps. What we're trying to do here is get you to do something that's pretty complex. And the way we're going to get you there is we're going to kind of nudge you along. And the way that we nudge you along here is we reward the steps in the right direction. So let's say that the complex target behavior is making your bed. You're 5 years old. And your parents could either decide to wait for you to make your bed on your own spontaneously, in which case they're going to be waiting a very, very long time. Or they can reward your successive approximations, your steps in the right direction, by giving you a reward, first of all, when you pull the bottom sheet up. And then the next time they give you a reward when you pull the bottom sheet and the blanket up. And the next time it could be bottom sheet, blanket, and comforter. And the next day it might be bottom sheet, blanket, comforter, and all your teddy bears on the bed, right? And so forth. You get the idea. We're moving you towards what we finally want you to be able to do. They do this at SeaWorld all the time. Training animals to do different tricks, whether it's dolphins or Shamu, or I guess we can't do Shamu anymore, whatever the case might be. With your dog, you might have used shaping to get them ultimately to go and do some final target behavior, okay? So we do shaping all the time. You do it when you coach a team, right? If you're coaching a T-ball team and you wait for your 5-year-old T-ball players to spontaneously turn a double play, you're going to be waiting a huge long time, okay? What you can do is reward their steps in the right direction. If you're an English teacher teaching 6th graders how to write a 2-page paper with an introductory paragraph and 3 paragraphs that are in the body of the paper and a final conclusion paragraph, if you wait for them to do that on their own, you might be waiting a long time. What you can do is shape their behavior and reward each of the little steps along the way. Does that make sense? Can you think of other scenarios where shaping has taken place? I'm almost certain you can. Okay, whether it's with little kids or animals or whatever, we do lots of shaping in school settings and other places for sure. All right? Yeah, with driving, that's another good example. Good. All right, I'm not going to beat that into the ground because I don't think it's, of the remaining concepts, I don't think it's a particularly difficult one. Let me give you another polling question because I just love doing this. Positive reinforcement blanks the rate of responding, whereas negative reinforcement blanks the rate of responding. What do you think there? See lots of people saying C. Why are you thinking that it's this? Why are you thinking that it's C? What did I say earlier? Yeah, reinforcement, I said always, always, always leads to more of the behavior. Seems like that has bled through effectively, so I'm pleased with that. Cool. All right, so 20 minutes to cover 2 major sets of concepts. We're in really good shape. Excellent. So let me bounce down to this one and distinguish for you between primary and secondary reinforcers. I alluded to this earlier, and now I'm going to be explicit about it here. Primary reinforcers are defined as reinforcers that in and of themselves are reinforcing, typically because they satisfy some kind of biological need. It's not always going to be the case, but typically we're talking about things that address a biological need, or maybe more broadly said, things that are biologically relevant, right? So if you do a good job and I give you M&Ms for doing a good job, cleaning up your toys, sharing your toys, helping me clean the kitchen, whatever the case might be, and I give you M&Ms, that's a primary reinforcer. If I give you water, sex would clearly be biologically relevant. Those are all primary reinforcers. If instead I chose to go the secondary reinforcer route, I'm doing something a little bit different. In this case, I'm using things that are serving as reinforcers because they're connected with those primary reinforcers. And when you see repeated pairings now, you should automatically be thinking, that sounds like classical conditioning. And that's really what goes on with secondary reinforcers. They become rewarding to us because they're repeatedly paired with things that are addressing and satisfying biological needs. So your prototypical secondary reinforcers are money, compliments, hugs, attention, applause, right? I like what you did so much that I'm going to bang my hands together, right? The most obvious of these secondary reinforcers in terms of how it connects with a primary reinforcer would be money, right? Money, if you ate it, it's weird to think about, I'm going to swallow some dollar bills, isn't going to satisfy a biological need. It's a piece of paper with green ink on it. But with the way our economy works, what happens is you can exchange that money for these things that are primary reinforcers, right? You can exchange it for food. You could exchange it for water. I guess you could exchange it for sex. I don't think that would be highly recommended, right? So at a Little League game like we had yesterday, we had our season opener. We won 12-6 because of my incredible managing, right? I could have reinforced them for doing a good job during the game by giving them food directly, right? What I could also have done is I could have used a secondary reinforcer and given them a snack bar ticket. You guys remember these, right? Little ticket, and you take it over to the snack bar and it's worth $1 or $2, whatever the hell it is, right? So the food itself directly would be a primary reinforcer. Those snack bar tickets would be a secondary reinforcer, right? What would a high five be? Primary or secondary? Kid arrives at third base, hits a triple, I give him a high five, I say good job, that's secondary, right? The cheers from the crowd, parents screaming and yelling and cheering their kids on, those are secondary reinforcers. You see the difference here? Basically it comes down to whether it's biologically relevant or not, okay? Some things are, some things aren't. For things that are, we call them primary reinforcers. For things that aren't, we call those secondary reinforcers. Any questions there? That's not too hard either, right? I mean, I guess we could argue if we're talking about a negative reinforcement scenario where the rat learns to escape the shocks, we could say that the shocks are really a primary reinforcer. If they were strong enough, they could be biologically relevant, right? And that would be like a negative reinforcement primary reinforcer. That's a little bit sort of a higher level example. I want you to basically walk away with, as if it's addressing biological needs, it's primary. If it's not, it's more indirect, then it's a secondary reinforcer. So your paycheck would be a secondary reinforcer. All right, good. Let me delete my scribbling so we can see what we're doing on the next slide, which begins the final set of new concepts that we're going to cover today. We're talking about reinforcement schedules. Now, here's the deal, guys. Okay. Reinforcement schedules are used to dictate how often reinforcement should be given, right? If you're wondering, as a new grad student in B.F. Skinner's lab, should I give the rat food every single time he presses on the bar? If Skinner says yes, then he's asking you to do continuous reinforcement, where you're reinforcing the behavior each and every time it occurs, okay? So in that scenario, what you're trying to do, usually with continuous reinforcement, is you're trying to get things going, right? You're trying to get things moving in the direction that you want them to. So you might do this on the front end, right? So when you first shared a toy with a sibling or a cousin or a neighbor or some other friend, right? Your parents probably reinforced that every single time that you did it, probably for a couple of weeks or more. Is anybody still getting like M&Ms in the mail from their parents when you report to them that you are sharing things with other kids in college? Probably not. I think Juan is joking with us, right? At some point, your parents probably moved to partial reinforcement where they're intermittently, right, every once in a while reinforcing those behaviors, right? So it might be like every couple of days I give you some kind of reinforcement for doing that. But I move away from the each and every time because that continuous reinforcement, let's be honest, right, that can be kind of tiring. Well, the deal is that partial reinforcement is going to be administered via these things that we know as reinforcement schedules. Okay, so if you want to do this partial reinforcement work, the way in which you do it is you administer that partial reinforcement with a reinforcement schedule. Here's the deal. If you've not been paying attention now. Reinforcement schedules break into two different types. One type is based on the number of times the person does the behavior. And the other type of reinforcement schedule is based on how much time has elapsed since the reward was last given, okay? We're going to call the ones that are based on the number of responses ratio schedules, and we're going to call the ones that are based on the passage of time interval schedules, and that's what I've got for you on my next slide. Okay. Ratio schedules, as I just said, are based on the number of responses. It's based on how many times you do X. Okay. So if I'm on a fixed ratio schedule, FR, the scenario is this. The reinforcer is going to be given after a fixed number of non-reinforced responses. Okay. Really simple idea. Say you work in a factory. And I don't know, your factory makes boxes for Amazon. I'm looking around my office that I just had to move into, right? You're a box maker for Amazon. And let's say you get paid for every 35 boxes that you produce. You're on a fixed ratio schedule, okay? If you are a car salesman and you get a bonus for every 10th car that you sell, no bonus for cars 1 through 9, bonus for car number 10. No bonus for cars 11 through 19, bonus for car number 20, okay? In those scenarios, you're on a fixed ratio schedule, right? If you wouldn't eat your broccoli when you were a kid, your parents might have put you on a fixed ratio schedule where after you ate 2 pieces of broccoli, you could have 6 French fries. And after you ate 2 more pieces of broccoli, they would reward you with 6 more French fries. That's fixed ratio. Variable ratio is the woman playing the slot machine here. It's one of the most powerful forces on the planet. I just love watching people in casinos because it's variable ratio reinforcement all over the place. And it's amazing to watch the persistence here. And in fact, when you're pulling on the lever of the slot machine, you're really not all that different from the rat pressing on the lever in the Skinner box, are you? Okay? Think about it. A variable ratio schedule is when a reinforcer is given after a variable number of non-reinforced responses. So in this case, she might pull on that lever 30 times, pull on the arm of the slot machine 30 times, and let's say she wins 6 times. If we do the math, she wins 6 out of 30, that's 1 out of 5. But she doesn't win on pulls 5, 10, 15, 20, and 25. Or 30, whatever the hell the numbers were, right? She wins on average about every 6 times or every 5 times, right? It's a variable number of times. So she might win on pull number 2, 8, 12, 22, 26, and 30. And then she won 6 times out of 30. She's on a variable ratio schedule of 1 every 5 on average. But again, not exactly every 5th. Does that make sense? Yeah, the amounts are always going to differ. It doesn't really matter, right? It just, the question is it fixed? Is it a set number of things you need to do? So if you are in the sandwich club at your local favorite sandwich shop and you get a free sandwich after you buy 8 sandwiches, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, no reward, 8th, punch on your card, you get a free sandwich, you're on a fixed ratio schedule, right? Yeah, so fixed is a set number. Variable, I don't know if I would call it random, but it's on average, right? So she pulls 6 times, she wins 6 times out of 30 pulls at 6 over 30. It's about 1 out of 5, but it's not 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, and 30. Does that make sense? Good. All right. Interval schedules are different because they're based on time, okay? Based on the time since your last reward. If it's an FI or fixed interval schedule, it's a set amount of time that has to elapse before you get the reward again, okay? I'm on a fixed interval schedule for getting paid here at SDSU. They pay me on the 1st of each month. If I do my job during this month of March, when April 1st rolls around, they'll pay me again. If I do my job during the month of March, during the month of April, when May 1st rolls around, they'll pay me again. It's a set amount of time that has to elapse, okay? If you want another example, if you check for the U.S. mail, which let's say comes every day at 1 p.m., okay, your checking for the U.S. mail behavior is going to be reinforced every 24 hours at 1 p.m. You could check it 800 other times during the day. It's only going to get reinforced at that fixed amount of time interval, right? If you used to have, a little bedtime snack before you went to bed, your parents let you have a couple scoops of ice cream or whatever it was, right? That is reinforcing your good behavior at home every 24 hours, right? A fixed interval, set amount of time. Variable interval, in contrast, would be like checking for email, right? U.S. mail would be fixed interval. It's every 24 hours exactly. The mail shows up. Email is variable. You could get one right now at 10:38. You might get another one at 10:48. And if you're lucky, you won't get another one till tonight at 10:48 p.m., right? But your checking behavior is reinforced on a variable amount of time schedule. So with variable interval schedules, the reinforcer is given for a response that occurs after a variable time interval has elapsed, okay? If you're a surfer, you're waiting for a wave, right? It's a variable amount of time. Over 1 hour in the ocean, maybe you get 5 really good waves. 60 over 5 means you're getting a good wave about every 12 minutes. But it's not at 11, 12, 24, 36, 48, and then noon that you get those really good waves. It averages out to that, right? So it's a variable amount of time that's passing, okay? So again, big picture, ratio schedules are always going to be about time. Ratio schedules are always going to be about the number of responses, whereas interval schedules are always going to be about time. So anytime I give you one of these questions, and we'll do a practice one before we finish up today. You should first decide whether the reward is being given based on the number of responses, if it is, its ratio, or is the reward being given about the passage of time? Then it's an interval schedule. Make sense? Let me show you what I've got pulled in from an old textbook because I thought the table was so good I decided to keep it even though we are using a different textbook here. So we've got ratio schedules in the top row. So a fixed ratio is every so many, right? Buy 10 coffees, get one free. Or you get paid per product unit produced. Every 35 boxes you get paid, right? Variable ratio, after an unpredictable number. Playing slot machines or fly casting. If you're a fisherman, you're not going to catch a fish on every fifth cast exactly, 5, 10, 15, and 20. Maybe it averages out to that, okay, about every fifth. So maybe you catch a fish on casts 3, 9, 11, and 20. Okay, there's 4 out of 20. It's about every fifth, but it's not set with a fixed number of times, right? It's a variable number of times. Interval schedules are always about time every so often. Taco Tuesday, your taco buying behavior is being reinforced on a fixed interval schedule. It's a set amount of time that has to elapse before you can get the good taco prices again. Variable interval, variable amount of time, right? Checking for a response to something that you did messaging someone on Facebook. Not like they're definitely going to respond at exactly noon every day or every hour. It's every so often. It's unpredictably often. That's what makes it VI or variable interval. All right. Let me give you my final polling question of the day. Do you want the Jeopardy song or no on the final question? Yes, almost everybody does. Okay. Final question is this one. So give it a shot. Let's hear the music. She's getting paid $18 for every 3 pages she edits. What kind of a schedule? Is it based on the number of behaviors or is it based on the passage of time? That tells you ratio or interval. Awesome. I'm just having so much fun with that music today. All right. I see a lot of people saying A. Tell me why it's A. What do you see in the question that nudges you towards a fixed ratio schedule response for this one? It's a fixed number. What is the fixed number? She's going to get $18 for every 3. Perfect. Looks like you guys have got that. Let me ask you something else here. The $18 that we give her, is that a primary reinforcer or a secondary reinforcer? Secondary, right? She can't eat it. Doesn't satisfy a biological need. Let me ask you one more question. Is this positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement? Yeah, it's positive. I'm presenting her with $18. It's going to lead to her doing more of this editing behavior. Look at all the stuff you know now, right? You just talked about reinforcement schedules, primary versus secondary reinforcers, and positive versus negative reinforcement. They should definitely pay me today. I've helped you guys learn a lot of stuff that you didn't know when we first got started here talking about operant conditioning. Final questions or comments before we wrap up? Let me remind you 2 things. Go to SI, and number 2, let me remind you to make sure you get your learning curve quizzes done. Because technically in the schedule and the syllabus, we are finishing up learning today, so they're due Sunday night at 11. Great practice. If you get good questions as you're doing them, where it's an example of classical conditioning or operant conditioning, copy and paste them into a Word document. Use those later on to be able to refer back to if you're encountering questions that feel like the kinds of polling questions we've been doing today. Okay? You're welcome for the music, no problem. Any final questions or comments before we wrap up? All right, cool. Thanks for being here. I appreciate your attendance, and I'll see you guys on Tuesday. Don't forget to get the learning curve stuff done. Bye, guys.